following presentation was recorded live by Voices from Jerusalem.
Historically, the period we're going to deal with the Babylonian exile, which is going to cover the Purim story. But in that, we want to look at, besides the notion of what diaspora means and its implications, we're also going to look at the holiday of Purim, which is my favorite holiday because it really is the holiday that explains how God acts in history, and also a very significant topic in terms of the survival of the Jewish people, which is the men of the Great Assembly. Remember, last class we left off with the destruction of the First Temple. And again, we look at these events, and destruction of the First Temple, no big deal. I said at the end of the last class, it's worth mentioning again now, what a shock this must have been to the collective, nervous system of the Jewish people. We have what normative Judaism is not what we practice today. And it's, again, one of the big problems of being Jewish is, for us, what we think is normal is not normal for anyone else. The unique idea of a people surviving without a national homeland in diaspora doesn't happen anywhere else in human history. Okay, Judaism was, we have to always remember this, which is why so much of what we do was, and we'll see some of that today with the men of the Great Assembly, was instituted by the rabbis to keep us from forgetting what Judaism is supposed to be. We're supposed to be in the land of Israel, right, with a temple, with a king, descendant of the house of King David, with a high priest, with a temple and temple service, and all the Jewish people living here. We have virtually none of that today. Today we're definitely closer. 100 years ago, this would have been a really weird topic. At least we're sitting in the land of Israel, a good percentage of the Jewish people, but this is still very far from what is normal. And we're going to look at today both from the perspective of how we were able to, basically miraculously survive in this way, and who was responsible for making that happen is definitely a major theme of what we're going to be talking about in the class today. Okay, so just a little bit of background. The diaspora we're talking about here, which is a short diaspora, 70 years, depending on how you calculate it, really 50 years from the destruction of the temple to the initial return, is not the kind of diaspora we have today. Now, the word diaspora, which I'm using, is a Greek word which means scattering. So really we call Babylon as the first diaspora community, but it really wasn't the same kind of diaspora in that today we have Jews scattered to the four corners of the earth. I always like to say, the two most ubiquitous products on the planet Earth, Jews and Coca-Cola. Right? You got them everywhere. The Babylonian exile, which again was a punishment, which is the way the Babylonians would pacify conquered people by just moving them around, the same way they had done many years earlier to the northern 10 tribes of Israel, they now do to the southern kingdom. They bring us down en masse to Babylon. So we're not scattered to the four corners of the earth, but nonetheless we're living in a very different situation. We're outside our national homeland. A small percentage of Jews stay in the land of Israel, but most go into diaspora. And as I also mentioned last week, we talked about that a decade prior to the destruction of the first temple, right, the Babylonians take the king, Yehoiachin, and the 10,000 best and brightest, and take them down to Babylon, which I said at the time seemed like a big disaster, a huge brain drain, but in hindsight is as everything in Jewish history is, we see why it was all done, right? God creates the cure before the disease. When those 10,000 Jews come down to Babylon, when the rest of the Jewish population comes down to Babylon, a decade later, what do they find? The Jewish infrastructure is in place for them, right? There's no massive assimilation of Jews. They find the yeshivas are there, and the mikveh, and the Beit Knesset, and the bagel guy, and the pickle seller, and the kosher butcher, and the day schools. It's all set up waiting for them. And as a consequence, what seemed to be a tremendous disaster, that 10,000 initial exile, saves the Jewish people. Think about it. Jump ahead in time 2,500 years to 100 years ago, for those of us who are from America. What did you have in America in 1880? You had 250,000 totally assimilated German Jews. And suddenly pours into America 2.5 million Jews from Eastern Europe escaping Tsarist persecution. What happens? They don't find yeshivas and synagogues and mikvahs and pickle sellers. They find 250,000 German Jews whose sole goal is to get their Eastern European, poor Yiddish-speaking cousins to assimilate as quickly as possible into American culture. And what's the consequence? You get the single greatest mass assimilation of Jews in Jewish history. We're a very significant percentage of the Jewish world, those Jews who came to America, which is the vast majority of the American Jewish community today, they all go off. All of us, if you're from the States, have grandparents or great-grandparents who went through this between 1880 and 1914. So we're dealing with so we see in hindsight it was a tremendously positive thing. Given that we had to go into exile as part of the divine plan, it's thank God did this in advance. It's a great example of God putting the cure before the disease. And we're going to look today at some of the characters. A lot of the most significant people in Jewish history are living in Babylon at the time. We have Daniel, right? Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, Mordechai, Esther. These are all people who are characters in this period of time. Now, just to talk a little bit about the political structure of the Jewish community in Babylon. The Babylonians were very tolerant people, very open. Okay, we don't know of really instances, with the obvious exception being the Purim story, which is pretty horrendous. But it seems that they basically let the Jews live and let live. As a matter of fact, the Babylonians appoint a community leader who is the representative to the Babylonian authorities for the Jewish community. He's given the title in Aramaic, Reish Galusa. Okay, Aramaic, people from Aramaic is a Western Semitic language. Semitic meaning Middle Eastern language related to Hebrew. Those of you who will go on are already learning Gemara, you'll see that's the language of the Talmud is Aramaic, because Aramaic was the lingua franca of the ancient Near East. Lingua franca, anyone know what lingua franca means? It means the French language. What does it mean? Aramaic was the French language. It's a term, it's an idiom. It means the international language. French in the 18th century was the language of diplomacy and trade. Today, certainly the lingua franca of the world is English, or at least American English. I don't know, English. My wife from London always tells me I don't speak English, I speak American. Yeah. But as Winston Churchill said, the English and Americans have everything in common but language. So, yeah.
It's interesting, just offhand, the international language of the post office is French. Because if you get airmail, it'll say Paragon.
That's in Israel. Because in the state of Israel, for some reason, the official languages are French, Hebrew, and Arabic. They really should be English, Russian, and then Hebrew, in my opinion. But okay, that's something that's entrenched in the Israeli mentality. But the reality is the spoken language of trade and culture in the world today is American English, although granted, American culture could arguably be an oxymoron, but that's a separate topic altogether. But in the ancient world, Aramaic, it's very important because we're going to talk a lot about language. It's a very important part of cultural and identity, especially the Jewish world. The Jewish community at this period of time, the major language is going to be Aramaic. And even in the land of Israel, people's first language on the street is going to be Aramaic. We'll talk more about language later. But this word, Reish Galusa, means Rosh Galut, the head of the diaspora. The Reish Galusa is a person who's a direct descendant of the house of King David. So he has noble status. Even though he's not a king in the land of Israel, he's recognized as not only being the representative of the Jewish community in Babylon, but also having a sort of noble status. And we're going to have, over the next 1,500 years, I believe it's something like 42 people who have that title. Okay, it's going to be a long line of people who all trace their ancestry back to King David. Just as we're going to have in the position of Nasi, president of the Sanhedrin, they're all going to be descended also from the house of King David through the family of Hillel and Rabbi Gamliel, because that's also sort of a noble status. The idea being we want to preserve the lineage of this family. Why? So God willing, we build the temple, we'll be able to find a person who is descended from King David who's fitting to be the king of the Jewish people. Okay, this is a noble line that's always preserved in Jewish history. It's the one real dynastic royal family. So you're going to have a split. We're going to see throughout Jewish history, going much later into history, the descendants of Hillel in Israel being the Nasi up until more or less that position until about the 4th century of the Common Era. And also going on much later in Babylon, you're going to have these guys who have this position of head of the diaspora community for over 1,500 years. It's a very old community. The oldest diaspora community in the world is Babylonian community. There's no question that Jews have lived in Babylon way before the Arabs who today live in Iraq live there. Okay, it's interesting, which is not a new thing. We'll find that in many places of the world, the Jewish community will predate the modern national or ethnic people that live in that country. Whether it be Arabs or many of the Germanic tribes that settle in Europe, Jews were actually there first. It's interesting. So we have not only one of the oldest people in one of the oldest countries in the world in the land of Israel, but even as a diaspora, we predate many civilizations that are there today. Okay, I wanted just a little bit of the chronology of what's going to go on at this period of time. Following Nebuchadnezzar, who's the emperor, whose general Nebuzaradan destroys the temple, talking about 422, the next king we have is a guy by the name of Mordach. Okay, and he's called in the Bible Evil Mordach. Now, one of the problems, by the way, in trying to place the events of Jewish history in what we know of Babylonian and Persian chronology are the following. A, the names used by the Torah sources are different from the names used in Persian records. Doesn't mean they're different people. It just means we're using different names to describe who they are. And not only that, in the Persian documents themselves, you have several people with the same name. You have several Dariuses. You have several Cyruses. You have several guys by the name of Xerxes, right? Xerxes or Artaxerxes. And we're not sure, just like with Pharaoh, who's the Pharaoh in the Exodus story, we're not sure exactly when these stories are taking place or who the Bible is talking about. Yes, sir?
Are the names that are used in the Torah or our writings in any way connected to the names that they're used?
Ever hear the question? Are the names used in the Torah connected? Yes. As a matter of fact, 100%. 100%. People like Koresh, we know is Cyrus. That for sure, everyone knows it's Cyrus. Which Cyrus? Okay, is a little bit more of a problem. A guy like Ahasuerus, who we're going to look at now, most historians say he's Artaxerxes. Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes, there's definitely a linguistic connection in the names. We're not sure, but there are connections. It's not like it's, well, this guy, here he's called Paul, and over there he's called John. There's no connection. There's similarities, but it's not such an easy thing to put this in the history. While there's much historicity to the story, we don't know exactly what is going on in terms of what period of time this fits into. We have Jewish chronology, but again, as we know, there's discrepancy between the chronology used in the Western world and the Jewish chronology, so combining not knowing exactly which name is which, and also having this 164-year discrepancy in the calendar used by Western scholars versus Jewish chronology makes it a little confusing. I'm just giving you that, not to in any way undermine the validity of the narrative in the Bible, but just to let you know that it's not so easy to put the Jewish events in the context of whatever Persian history we've been able to piece together. So we have Nebuchadnezzar, okay, and follows Mordach. Following Mordach, and by the way, Mordach we say overlaps with Nebuchadnezzar by 2 years. They rule sort of jointly. Then we have Belshazzar. Now, why am I giving you the chronology? I'm not going to test you on the Babylonian monarchy, but because Jeremiah the prophet and all the prophecies you're reading in the Bible are not describing past events, but what will be in the future. Describe that in 70 years, God would remember the Jewish people, and he'd bring them back. Our understanding is that the emperors of Babylon took this very seriously. These were spiritual guys. They may have been idolatrous, but they were spiritual. They may have been polytheists, but they had a certain amount of fear of the God of Israel. Okay, and they didn't want to mess. And they knew Jeremiah's prophecy. How did they know it? Well, first of all, they knew it because many of their advisors were Jewish. People like Daniel, that were advisors too. People like Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel being one of the men of the Great Assembly, a prophet, a person who's very high up in Babylonian. In the Babylonian administration, they were aware of what Jeremiah had said, and they didn't want to touch. They didn't want to touch like the vessels of the temple they had pillaged. They didn't want to mess with the Jewish people too much because they were afraid that who knows what happens, So they were calculating, when is this 70 years going to be up so that we can see, is the Jewish God going to do what he says he's going to do? Maybe he's going to give up on his people. Maybe he's not powerful enough to overcome, the Babylonian God, Marduk, whatever the different gods they had. Okay, we don't know exactly what's going on in their head. But when we get to the king, it's about 374 BCE, Jewish chronology. Belshazzar, who comes after Mordach. He does an accounting. By the way, you look at art scrolls on the Megillah, they have a great summary of all of this if you want details of how they made the mistake and what they did. And Belshazzar gets to, I'll read you, by the way, it says Jeremiah. You want to hear the prophecy? Jeremiah 25, chapter 25, verse 12. And it shall come to pass when 70 years are fulfilled. Okay, by the way, the calculation is from the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's original conquest of Yehuda. Okay, that I will punish the king of Babylon and the nation, saith the Lord, for its iniquity. So Belshazzar is doing a calculation, and he figures out that the 70 years is up, but he's wrong. Okay, and we have several stories in the Bible of people calculating wrong. Classic case, Moses going up Mount Sinai 40 days. Jewish people miscalculate, think he's dead, and make the golden calf. So
What's the prediction one that I said?
This is Jeremiah the prophet. This is chapter 25, verse number 12.
And 70 years.
It's beginning with the initial exile. The problem is there's a lot. They didn't calculate when is it beginning, and they figured the time had elapsed. And he goes and has a huge party. It says he whips out all the vessels from the temple, the holy vessels, which were all kept sort of in, storage, and no one would mess with them. He has a big party. Okay, he's basically saying it's basically a real in-your-face kind of affair to God. And it says that night a hand appears and writes on the wall, a disembodied hand. You guys see the expression, the writing on the wall? Interesting, by the way, if you're a scholar of English literature, most idiomatic expressions in the English language come from one of two places. Where? You want to say it also? Very good. Shakespeare and the Bible. Virtually all the great idiomatic expressions we know of come from those two sources. Two greatest works of literature, right? So the writing, he didn't see the writing on the wall, is referring to Belshazzar. A hand appears, writes in Aramaic, which is the same as Hebrew, a coded message, he can't read it. Belshazzar, another instance of where a Gentile great ruler needs a Jew to interpret something for him, just like in Joseph in the dream story. He calls in Daniel, okay, and I'll read you exactly. This is from Daniel chapter 5, and Daniel interprets the coded message. God counted your kingship and terminated it. You were weighed on the scales of judgment and found lacking. Your kingship is broken up and given to Media and Persia. So that night, the armies of Darius the First, it's the Medes and the Persians, another rising empire also in that part of the ancient Near East, are expanding into the Babylonian Empire. They march on Babylon. They conquer the Babylonian Empire. They kill Belshazzar. The Babylonian Empire ceases to exist, and it is now absorbed by the new empire, which is going to be called Persia. And there are, by the way, several Persian empires in history. We're going to talk about later Persian empires, but we'll call it for now Persia. So what do we have in that part of the world, just to keep it straight? You have first Assyria, then Babylon, then Persia. So they're all great Mesopotamian empires, one after the other, all interacting with the Jewish people. Cyrus, by the way, who becomes emperor of the now defunct Babylonian Empire, he issues a decree allowing the Jews to go back. Now, we found a record of this decree, by the way. I believe it is I think it's in the British Museum, I'm not sure, where Cyrus is describing, unlike the Assyrians and Babylonians would exile people and move them into their country, the Persians don't follow that. They allow people to return. Now, we actually have a document of Cyrus describing all the peoples who he's allowing to go back. Notably absent are the Jews. Now, we know they were in Persia. No historian argues that the Jews were in Babylon. And we all agree that that's an event. What's interesting is in that document, it doesn't mention Jews being allowed to go back. Yet in the book of Ezra, which is chapter 1, verse number 2, it says, "The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of earth and has commanded me to build him a temple in Jerusalem." So he says, Jews, you may go back now. You've only been here a few decades, and go build your temple. Pretty wild. A complete reversal of policy. Sort of like the English, in this century. We'll give you, Balfour Declaration. You can establish His Majesty's government, looks with favor upon the establishment in Palestine of a national homeland for the Jews. Great declaration in human history. So you'd imagine that all the Jews would be, yeah, let's pack and go. What happens historically? The Bible again describes Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, who, by the way, is a descendant of the great-grandson of King Jehoiachin. Okay, one of the last kings, the second to last king of Yehuda. He leads the Jewish people back. How many Jews go? Now, we don't know how many Jews are in Babylon. We have an estimate of, well over 1 million Jews are in Babylon. Okay, about 42,000 Jews go back. Works out to probably about 5% of the Jewish population that went into exile 50 years before goes back. 95% stay. It's pretty interesting. What do you mean, 95% stay? Think about it, though. 5% go back. Israel, 1948, declared a state. There are about 12 million Jews in the world, of whom, when Israel was declared a state, 600,000 are living in the land of Israel. What percentage of 12 million to 600,000? It's 5%. 5%. It's interesting. Same number of Jews go back, more or less. Give or take. We don't have exact numbers. Question is why? Why do you think? Why didn't all the Jews go back? Why didn't all the Jews go back? Forget the ancient scenario. Look at the modern scenario. The answer is obvious. Why don't all the Jews go back to the land of Israel in 1948? Right, because the diaspora is nice. Okay, the Babylonian diaspora is nice. The diaspora in Brooklyn is nice. There are plenty of, forget secular Jews who are not Zionistic and don't know anything about Torah and don't know we're supposed to be in the land of Israel. There are tens of thousands of even ultra-Orthodox Jews living in very nice places like Borough Park and Muncie and whatever, who are quite comfortable there. Matter of fact, I think some of them actually believe that the Messiah is already here. It can't get better than this. We have this world, and we have the spiritual world and the physical world. We have a nice big house in America and a nice standard of living and 2 cars, and we have nice day schools, and our kids are religious, and it's nice. Okay, this is we see this as a repeated pattern in Jewish history. By the way, one that we should be very wary of, because God might give us a little breathing space in diaspora, but we see in the long run He's not going to allow us to stay. He's not going to allow us to stay. And one of the great patterns we're going to see over and over again that's going to appear early on is the higher we rise, the deeper we fall. The nicer the diaspora is, the bigger the reaction against the Jews. You see it in Egypt, right? Jews prosper, right? Pharaoh, we get the best real estate, we expand greatly, and look what happens. We end up as slaves. And we'll see it. I don't want to go into all the examples now. In your own brains, you just think about a couple of great examples, you'll come up with all kinds. And that should be a lesson to us, even for those Jews in America who are quite Torah observant, etc. We should never think that this is where we're meant to stay in diaspora for too long. It's not going to work out. So, Zerubbabel goes back, 42,000 Jews. What does he find? A small remnant of Jews who had stayed in the land of Israel. The Samaritans, remember those not-so-good Samaritans? They're up in the north, making a lot of trouble for the Jews, by the way. And the Bible describes, if you look in Ezra, for instance, it talks about how the Jews had intermarried, the community that stayed, lacking strong central leadership and lacking a temple and everything else. This description is terrible. It sounds like the whole community had married non-Jewish women. And by the way, you can actually count the number of people. I think it's 112 people that intermarried. But this is perfect. The Bible says they all intermarried. This is the same way the Bible always criticizes the Jewish people. One Jew does something wrong, the whole Jewish community is blamed. Collective responsibility. Now today, we're in a situation where the intermarriage rate is approaching 60% in America. We shouldn't read the Bible and think they were doing then what we're doing now. God forbid. I mean, there would be no Jewish people left in the world if we had an intermarriage rate 2,500 years ago of close to 60%. The difference being is 2,500 years ago, one Jew intermarrying was an outrage. It's like everything in the world. You know, when I was a little kid, no one would shoot a police officer. They were like, holy, you didn't shoot police officers. Remember this, by the time I got to the mid-70s, police officers getting shot every day. Once society accepts something as being normal, then it starts happening everywhere. So it's interesting, the description of what's going on. So the Jews come back. They start to rebuild the city. What's the first thing the Jews want to rebuild in Jerusalem? We talk about Jerusalem being rebuilt. What has to be rebuilt? No, the temple. The temple. You can't be a Jew without a temple. You can't live normative Judaism without a temple. The Samaritans immediately send a message to Cyrus saying, stop the Jews. If you let them rebuild the temple, they're going to rebel. And Cyrus believes it, and he freezes the building of the temple. We say for 18 years, the temple's frozen. And it's during that 18-year period that the Purim story is going to take place. So everything's kind of at a halt. Okay? Now, eventually what's going to happen, just to jump ahead a little bit, is Ezra and Nehemiah, who were both men of the Great Assembly. We're going to talk about the Great Assembly in a few minutes. They're also going to come back to Jerusalem. These are two extremely important people in the rebuilding of the temple and in the early First Temple period. Okay, people on a tremendously high level. Ezra, we know of his greatness is the spiritual rebuilding of the Jewish people. He's the one who gathers the Jews together, and he gives them tremendous tochacha criticism, and he gets them to return. Those Jews who had intermarried, going to divorce their wives and come back to Judaism. Nehemiah is the person who's going to be responsible for the physical rebuilding of the city. He very rapidly, in the space of a very short number of weeks, is going to rebuild the walls of the city, because without walls, the city's unprotected. He's going to be responsible for finally putting the second temple into place. So we're talking about two extremely important people. About Ezra, it said, in Sanhedrin and in 21b, Ezra was worthy of having the Torah given through him had not Moshe Rabbeinu preceded him. That's pretty incredible. That's a really high piece of praise there. It shows you what a level he was on, that if he had been born earlier, he could have been the person who would have given the Jewish people Torah at Mount Sinai. Okay. What I want to do now is to talk about the story of Purim, because it takes place during this time. The story of Purim is mentioned in Megillat Esther. And it's a very significant story for a number of reasons. One, it's the only rabbinic holiday. There are only two rabbinic holidays in Judaism. What's the other one? Hanukkah, right. We have Hanukkah and Purim. Rabbinic meaning it's not one of those holidays written in the Torah like Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. Okay? Not only is it one of the two rabbinic holidays, it's the only Jewish holiday that takes place in diaspora. Hanukkah, which takes place later, which is another very important holiday in terms of Jewish history, takes place in the land of Israel during the Greek occupation, which is our topic for tomorrow. Purim takes place when the Jews are in the diaspora, during this period of time when the rebuilding of the temple has been temporarily frozen. Okay? Now, Purim is a fascinating holiday for a number of reasons. you want to read the story of Purim, it's in one of the later books of the Bible called the Megillat Esther. Okay? It's the only book of the Bible, of the 24 books of the Jewish Bible, that doesn't have God's name written in it. Yet I would say it's the book of the Bible where in many ways God's presence can be felt more intensely than in any other story of the Bible. And there are no open miracles in the story. It's a fascinating story. If you want to understand how God acts in history, study the book of Esther. Now, just to give you a little, are people familiar with the holiday of Purim? Okay, so I don't have to go through the whole, again, I don't have to go through the whole Megillah, as they say. It's a great expression in Judaism. Megillah being like a word in Jewish speak for like a whole long story or spiel. Okay, that's what a Megillah means. It's a scroll. The story is the Jewish people are all living in diaspora. The temple is frozen. Now, when I say all living in diaspora, all living in the Persian Empire, there's no, by the way, communities outside the Persian Empire. There's the 127 provinces of the Persian Empire, meaning that there's not like a community in Brooklyn that was outside the control of Persia, meaning whatever the king of Persia would decree would affect every single Jew on the planet Earth, which is very significant. It's not like a modern Holocaust story where even if Hitler, God forbid, destroyed all the Jews in Europe, there still would have been a Jewish community in America, let's say, or in Australia or England. Okay? What's the background? The king is Ahasuerus. Okay, he comes after Cyrus. He is probably this guy, Artaxerxes. Okay? Don't know for sure, but that's, if anyone is it, that's the most likely candidate for the story. Artaxerxes is married, in the narrative, he's married to a woman whose name is Vashti. Vashti is Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. Why does he marry the daughter of the king? To get legitimacy, marry into nobility. They have a fight. I'm going through this very quickly because I just want to give you the background. He ends up having Vashti executed. Then he needs a new queen. So what does he do, being an all-powerful guy, like we don't have anyone like this in the world today? He has to check out every single female, like between the age of 3 and 30. Who does he pick? Of all the women in the greatest physical empire on the planet Earth at the time, you're talking about a lot of women here. Like we're talking about a major selection process here. Forget the Miss America pageant. Who does he pick? He picks a woman by the name of Esther, who, according to the simple reading of the text, when I say simple, the Megillah, you have to also read the Megillah with tractate Megillah in the Talmud, because there you find out all what's really going on. According to the Megillah, okay, Esther is the niece of the Gadol Hador, the leader of the Jewish community, one of the great scholars, the greatest scholar of his time, whose name is Mordechai. Okay, of all the people he takes. But if you read in the Talmud, it says that Esther is what? Mordechai's wife. Can you imagine? What a disaster. God forbid, imagine the Rosh Hashiva, you know. The Arabs going to take over and they take the Rebbitzin as their, you know, that's the Sheikh's new wife. God. Sorry?
His niece?
It's his niece and his, also he married his niece. Yeah, he raised her and married her. It's an interesting story what's going on there. But it's a huge, the Jewish people are all like, oh my God, this is a disaster. Of all the women in the entire, what's going on here? I mean, what's God doing to us? Maybe God's forgotten. He's had enough of us. He's just thrown us at the mercy of this crazy king. Even worse than that, what does he do then? Ahasuerus appoints as his minister, his commander-in-chief, a man by the name of Haman. What's Haman's name? Haman's full name is Ha'agagi. Haman the Agagite. Who's Agag? Remember the story? Of King Saul going into battle when he's commanded by God through Samuel to wipe out the Amalekites, and he spares, stupidly, he listens to the people, his fatal mistake. And he spares King Agag. King Agag is allowed to survive long enough to propagate. Okay? And this is Amalek. Amalek, as soon as Amalek gets into a position where Amalek is able to kill the Jew, Amalek has a pathological hatred of God and the Jewish people, God's representatives on earth. As soon as Amalek comes into power, what's Amalek going to do? Kill all the Jews. So look what's going on here. I mean, this is a disaster lining up. Rosh Hashiva's wife, taken to be, you know, the sheikhs, you know, whatever, the wife of the emperor of Persia, the biggest arch enemy of the Jews is in power, and he immediately decrees on a specific day by throwing lots. They just toss a coin. What's the best day to kill the Jews? They pick a day. On that day, every single Jewish man, woman, and child is going to be annihilated. It's a Holocaust. It's a Holocaust. It's a disaster. What happens in the story, without going through all the details? Everything is flipped over. Okay, we see that because Esther hides her identity and doesn't say she's from the Jews. She eventually is able to go to her husband, the emperor, and say, you know, please spare my life. And the emperor says, who would dare touch you? And she says, you know, this evil guy, Haman. And he ends up, it's amazing, the gallows that Haman builds to hang Mordechai, he ends up being hung on. the Jewish people are given permission to kill out not only the Amalekites, but are given free reign to murder all the anti-Semites in the Persian Empire, who, by the way, because there was a decree saying that the Jews could be killed, they all come out of the woodwork. So they all identify themselves openly. Like today, in America, most of the extreme right-wingers who hate Jews won't say anything because it's not politically correct. Can you imagine if a decree is issued? So it's great. They all have big marks on their head. They've all been running around for weeks saying to their Jewish neighbors, I'm going to get you, I'm going to get you. And now suddenly when the Jews are given permission to kill them, they know exactly who they are. Everything is flipped over in the story. And in the end, Mordechai ends up being up there as one of the chief advisors to the Emperor of Persia, and all that seems to have been an impending disaster turns out to be a tremendous victory for the Jewish people. A question, Max? Yeah.
Is it halakhically permissible to marry your niece?
It depends on what relation. If it's through, there definitely situations yes, situations no. In this situation, yes. If you want, I'll explain after how it works. Interesting. We don't. It says that she stays as the queen. They have, according to Jewish tradition, even that therefore that Darius, Daryavish the second, is probably, can't prove it through Persian records now, could well be Jewish. He's the one who allows the Jews to finish building the temple, and it could be. I can't say this definitively through secular sources we have and outside Jewish sources, but that could be the case. There's no narrative after explaining what happens after the story, but at the very end it seems that they stay married actually. But anyway, to just show what's so interesting about the story. Okay, first of all, we see a seeming disaster ends in a tremendous victory. At the end of the story, it says the Jewish people, v'kiblu v'kimu, right? They accepted upon themselves Torah on a level that was unprecedented in Jewish history. Now, it's interesting. What is the holiest day in the Jewish year? Excuse me. Sorry? Yom Kippur. Now, K in Hebrew is the prefix for the word like. The rabbis say Yom Kippur is a day like Purim. And by the way, the real day of acceptance of Torah, Shavuos is the day when God gives Torah. But the Jewish people, because we worship the golden calf, we didn't accept it. Moses loses it. He goes up the mountain. He has to get Torah again. He comes down on what day with Torah a second time? Yom Kippur. That's the real day of Kabbalah HaTorah. The acceptance of Torah is really Yom Kippur. Now, what do we do on Yom Kippur? It's interesting. Yom Kippur, we pray, we don't eat, we afflict ourselves. It's a really heavy, holy day. The rabbis are saying Yom Kippur is a day like Purim? I mean, Purim, it's a rabbinic holiday. What do you do on Purim?
Drink.
You read the Megillah, you do the exact opposite of Yom Kippur. You have to eat. The only rabbinic commandments are to have a big meal and to drink ad shelo yoda.
But don't we fast before?
No, there's an idea of a fast of Esther, but it commemorates historical events. It's the most minor of all the fasts. But the fast is... Yeah, but it's not. But on the day itself, you do the exact opposite. The exact opposite. What's going on? Totally different. I mean, Mount Sinai, we're talking about a direct experience of God. Here, God is not mentioned anywhere. As a matter of fact, the whole Bible, I said before, the book of Esther, God's name isn't mentioned. The Hasidim like to say, whenever you see the word Hamelech, meaning the king, it's talking about not just the Achashverosh, it's talking about God. It's the day where there are no open miracles, yet at the end of the story, God's presence is felt more strongly than virtually any other story in the Bible. Now, the rabbis also ask, because, have you guys seen codes in the Torah? They also ask, where do you see Esther hinted at in the 5 books of Moses, being that the 5 books of Moses are written way before the story of the Megillat Esther? And they quote from the book of Deuteronomy, one of the negative prophecies where God says, Astir, astir et panav, I will surely hide my face. Esther, Hester, the word in Hebrew for hiding your face, the term is called Hester Panim. They're saying there's a connection. Esther as in the heroine versus Hester Panim as in the Bible, hiding your face. They're not just having fun with words. They're saying that the whole concept of the book of Esther is the idea of Hester Panim, meaning that in the time of the First Temple period, we had prophecy and open miracles, and God's presence was seen clearly. You could feel God in Jerusalem. But God is always here. But once we get past the First Temple period, the level of spirituality in general is lower, and our ability to relate to God from that period of time onward is going to be much less direct. God will not act in history in the open manner he had previously, which is why we have such a problem with miracles today, because we don't have them. But God is always there. He's the master puppeteer behind the scenes, putting everything into place. This is the ultimate story of God putting the cure before the disease. Everything, it's a seeming disaster. In hindsight, works out. So at the end of the story, the Jewish people look back and they go, whoa, this is incredible. God runs the world. Look at how all these seeming disasters, down to the smallest detail, worked out. Why do you get drunk on Purim? It says you get drunk so you can't tell the difference between Baruch, Mordechai, and Or Chaman. Blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. Meaning, even when you're drunk, you're not so clear what's going on. Even when you're not in control and you don't see clearly, there's always a being that is in control. The story is, you don't see what's going on? Believe me. It's out of your control. Don't worry. God is always there. It's such an interesting holiday. Everything's not what it seems, which is why you wear masks. Okay? Nothing's what it seems. People who aren't what they seem. The whole holiday, Purim, what's Purim come from? Pur is what? It's a Hashverosh and Haman get together and basically draw lots, because they were into astrology, to decide by chance what is an auspicious time to kill the Jews. The essence of Amalek is chance. He stands for chance. There's no God. That's a very Amalekite idea. You want to know why Jews don't like the idea of evolution, the chance part of evolution? You can see it's a very Amalekite idea. There's no God. It's the ultimate denial of reality. What's Haman saying? There's no God. We'll use astrology. We'll work out through, Purim. The name of the holiday is chance. Yet there's nothing in the story that happens by chance. It's the ultimate, as we say, the word that describes the whole holiday, v'nafachu, flipped over story. It's the ultimate story where everything is flipped over. Everything it seems by coincidence, we see is planned. Nothing is as it seems, and in the end, when you look back, it all fits together, and you see God acting in a way that even though there's no open miracles, it's that much more impressive. And believe me, to see God acting in a more hidden way in history is a much more powerful thing often, because it requires a lot more looking and free will to see, which is why the rabbis say Yom Kippur is really a greater holiday than Purim is a greater holiday than Yom Kippur. Because it's a harder holiday to relate to in many respects, to see God. But this is the holiday of diaspora. This is how God is going to act in history. I always say Jewish history, I used this example before. It's like that 6,000-piece jigsaw puzzle again, with no picture to show you how it fits together. It doesn't seem to make any sense. You dump the pieces out on the table. But when you finish with the puzzle, you look back and you see everything fits in. Nothing happens by accident. There's a design to it all. God is always there, even though we don't see him. This is a microcosm of what is going to be. The Persian community is the first diaspora community, and it's a mini version of what will be for the Jewish people throughout human history. We're not going to have open miracles anymore, yet God is always going to be around. He's never absent. And all you have to do is have eyes that are the acumen to look carefully into what's going on, to see that nothing's happening by chance. And certainly when, just as in the story of Purim, when it's over, we look back and we see how everything fits into place, so too, in general, in all of Jewish history, everything fits. Nothing is by chance. Everything has a reason, and God will make sure that even in the worst circumstances, we're always going to have a way out so that we can accomplish our mission in history. Yes, Max?
I think maybe you touched on this, but did you mention, I heard somewhere that this was a time when the Jewish people actually re-accepted the covenant?
Yes, it says they kiblu v'kimu. That's the exact word. They rededicated themselves because they were so blown away by the sea.
But in some of the Midrash, where the like 3 days after the event at Sinai, I think it's like God is supposedly holding Sinai over the heads of the Jewish people. Right.
Which doesn't mean that the mountain was lifted up. It means that's a great point Max is bringing in. It says that God at Mount Sinai holds the mountain over the Jewish people. Meaning if they accept Torah, great. If not, I drop the mountain on them. But another very interesting meaning of that story is when you're standing at Mount Sinai and you've just heard God speak, you don't have free will, really. It's a much easier on many levels. Open miracles is a way of zapping yourself. Who's not going to accept Torah when you're having prophecy? That's the point. So Purim is much harder. Purim is no open miracles, no God standing before you clearly like you see at Mount Sinai. Okay? Yet the reality is it's a much bigger free will decision. It's much higher level to be on this Purim story than the Mount Sinai story, which is why we say Purim is such a tremendously big holiday, why it's so important, why it really is the holiday of Jewish history. Because what happens there, every aspect of it is going to be mirrored over and over again throughout Jewish history. And it's the classic case of God always putting the cure before the disease. So if you want to understand how God acts in history since the destruction of the first temple, you study the holiday of Purim. Okay, I want to stop here. I was going to try and do the Men of the Great Assembly. That's a very important topic, which I'd rather pick up with tomorrow. So what we're going to do tomorrow's class is talk about the Second Temple period, Men of the Great Assembly, and what is an extremely important topic to understand, the termination of prophecy.
This program is part of a series. For the continuation, please insert the next disc.